"Officer, before you make the biggest mistake of your career, read the name on that card." Naomi Carter said it quietly, almost too quietly for the people crossing the courthouse plaza to hear, but Officer Daniel Mercer heard every word, and instead of slowing down, he let out a short breath through his nose, as if her calmness irritated him more than any argument could have. It was 12:17 on a bright Tuesday afternoon in downtown Richmond, Virginia, the kind of early spring day when office workers carried takeout bags across the square, attorneys checked their phones between hearings, and the broad stone steps of the courthouse reflected the pale sunlight back into the street. Naomi had been standing less than 40 feet from the main entrance when Mercer stopped her. She wore a charcoal gray suit beneath a light coat, low black heels, and a simple leather bag over one shoulder. In one hand, she carried a clear plastic container with a salad she had barely touched. In the other was a thick blue case file marked for an afternoon hearing. Nothing about her posture suggested panic. Nothing about her voice suggested guilt. But Mercer had already decided what he believed he was seeing. He had noticed her near the restricted employee entrance, watched her swipe a courthouse identification card, and stepped between her and the door before she could finish explaining why she was there. "That entrance is for authorized personnel," he told her. Naomi looked at him for a moment, then glanced toward the badge on his chest. "I know." 2 words. Calm. Controlled. Mercer shifted his weight. "Then you know I need to see identification." Naomi reached slowly into her bag, removed a government-issued credential, and held it out. He took it, looked at the photograph, then at her face, but his eyes barely traveled lower. "Where did you get this?" he asked. The question changed the air between them. Naomi's expression did not. "It was issued to me by the courthouse." Mercer gave a humorless smile. "That's not what I asked." Around them, the noon crowd continued moving, but a few people had begun to notice. A young paralegal slowed near the steps. A delivery driver paused beside his bicycle. 2 women carrying coffee glanced over, then exchanged the uneasy look people give when they sense a situation becoming something larger than it should be. Naomi could feel their attention, but she kept her eyes on Mercer. She had spent years in courtrooms listening to people raise their voices when facts failed them. She had learned that volume was not authority, and composure was not weakness. "Officer," she said, "my name and title are printed on that credential." Mercer looked down again, but only for a second. "People use fake IDs all the time. Then verify it." He frowned. "Don't tell me how to do my job." There it was. Not a question anymore. Not an investigation. A challenge. Imagine standing there with your own name in another person's hand, watching him refuse to believe the evidence because he had already chosen a different story about you. Naomi could have raised her voice. She could have demanded a supervisor. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Mercer mistook that silence for surrender. He reached for his radio, spoke briefly into it, then turned back toward her. "Until I figure out what you're doing here, you're being detained." A few more people stopped. Naomi looked toward the courthouse doors. Somewhere beyond those doors, clerks were preparing files, attorneys were arranging exhibits, and a courtroom on the 4th floor was waiting for the judge assigned to a high-profile misconduct hearing scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes. That judge was standing in the sunlight with her lunch in one hand and her identification in the other. Mercer still had no idea. Naomi exhaled slowly. "You may want to call inside before you continue." But Mercer had already made up his mind. He asked her to place her hands behind her back, and moments later the soft metallic click of handcuffs cut through the ordinary noise of the plaza. Conversation stopped. A phone rose into the air. Then another. Naomi lowered her eyes, not in shame, but toward the blue file that had slipped from beneath her arm and landed near Mercer's shoe. Across the cover, in clean black lettering, were 4 words he still had not bothered to read. Honorable Judge Naomi Carter. For several seconds, Naomi Carter said nothing. The courthouse plaza seemed to narrow around her, every passing sound suddenly sharper than before. The hiss of a city bus stopping at the curb, the scrape of shoes against stone, the distant bell from a nearby office tower announcing the quarter hour. Officer Daniel Mercer stood beside her with the confidence of a man who believed the situation had already been settled. To him, the handcuffs were proof that he had taken control. To Naomi, they were evidence of something very different. She looked down at the blue case file resting near his shoe. Its cover turned just enough for anyone paying attention to read the name printed across it. Mercer was not paying attention. Instead, he reached for Naomi's leather bag and asked, "Do you have anything in here I should know about?" Naomi lifted her chin slightly. "You have not established any reason to search my belongings." Mercer gave her a tired look. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." "No," Naomi replied. "I am asking you to follow procedure." A murmur moved through the small crowd. The young paralegal standing near the courthouse steps had taken out her phone. So had the delivery driver. Across the plaza, two attorneys who had been talking over coffee stopped mid-conversation and began watching more closely. Mercer noticed the growing audience, and something in his expression changed. Pride had entered the moment now. Backing down would mean admitting that he might have been wrong, and he was not ready to do that. "You were trying to enter a restricted area with questionable identification," he said louder, making sure everyone nearby could hear him. Naomi glanced at the credential still in his hand. Questionable to whom? The question landed softly, but Mercer did not answer. He looked at the card again, his thumb covering part of the printed title. He had seen the official seal. He had seen Naomi's photograph. He had seen the courthouse security markings. Yet every fact seemed to collide with an assumption he had formed before she ever spoke. Inside the courthouse, 3 floors above them, Court Clerk Emily Brooks checked the clock mounted over the courtroom doors. 12:23. The afternoon misconduct hearing was scheduled for 12:35, and Judge Carter had never been late. Emily looked toward the judge's empty chambers, then toward the stack of documents waiting on the bench. "Has anyone seen Judge Carter?" she asked. Chief Bailiff Thomas Reed looked up from his desk. "She went out for lunch about 20 minutes ago." Emily frowned. Naomi always returned early. Always. She checked her phone and saw no message. Then a junior clerk hurried through the side entrance, breathing quickly from the stairs. "There is something happening outside," he said. "A police officer has detained a woman near the employee entrance." Emily barely reacted until he added, "I think it is Judge Carter." The room went still. Thomas Reed stood so quickly that his chair rolled backward several feet. "What did you say?" Outside, Naomi could not hear any of that. Mercer had finally set her identification on the hood of his patrol vehicle while he called dispatch. "I need verification on a courthouse credential," he said. Naomi watched him carefully. "You could have done that before putting me in handcuffs." Mercer ignored the comment. Dispatch asked him to read the identification number. He did. There was a pause. Then another. Mercer looked impatiently toward the radio. "Do you have it?" The dispatcher responded, but the crowd noise made the words difficult for the people around him to hear. Mercer heard them clearly. His face changed for less than a second. It was small, almost invisible, but Naomi noticed. "Repeat that," he said. Before the dispatcher could answer again, a sound came from behind them. Heavy courthouse locks released one after another. Conversations across the plaza faded. Mercer slowly turned toward the building. The tall glass doors were beginning to swing open. The courthouse doors opened wider, and the first person through them was Chief Bailiff Thomas Reed, his dark suit moving sharply against the pale stone behind him. Emily Brooks followed 2 steps behind, then 3 attorneys, a court reporter, and finally Chief Judge William Harrison, whose expression was calm but unmistakably serious. The small crowd on the plaza shifted almost as one body. Officer Daniel Mercer looked from the courthouse staff to Naomi Carter, then back again, as if his mind were trying to rearrange the scene into something that made sense. Thomas Reed reached the bottom step first. "Judge Carter," he called, his voice carrying across the plaza. The words seemed to erase every other sound. Mercer stopped moving. Naomi did not. She simply turned her head toward Reed and answered, "Mr. Reed." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Before, people had been watching a police officer question a woman they did not know. Now they were watching a police officer stand beside a judge in handcuffs. Mercer looked down at the credential resting on the hood of his patrol vehicle. For the first time, he read every line. Naomi Carter, Circuit Court Judge, authorized courthouse access. The same name was printed on the blue file lying several feet away. The same name had been spoken by the chief bailiff in front of everyone. Chief Judge Harrison walked down the steps slowly, not rushing, not raising his voice. That made the moment heavier. "Officer," he said, "remove the handcuffs." Mercer swallowed. "Your Honor, I was verifying an identification issue." Harrison glanced toward Naomi. then toward the credential. Was the identification invalid? Mercer hesitated. I had concerns. That was not my question. Emily Brooks stood near the stairs with one hand pressed against the folder she was carrying. She had worked with Naomi for 6 years. She had seen her preside over emotional family cases, complex civil disputes, and hearings where every person in the room seemed ready to speak at once. Naomi rarely raised her voice. She did not need to. The same steadiness was there now. Mercer unlocked the handcuffs and stepped back. Naomi brought her hands forward slowly, then adjusted the sleeve of her coat. She did not glare at him. She did not smile. Somehow, that restraint made Mercer look even more uncertain. Thomas Reed picked up the blue file and handed it to her. Your hearing begins in 8 minutes. Naomi looked toward the courthouse clock visible through the glass. Then we should not keep everyone waiting. She turned toward the steps, but Chief Judge Harrison remained where he was. Judge Carter, before you go inside, I need to know whether you want a supervisor called. Naomi paused. Several phones were still recording. Mercer noticed them now. He seemed to notice everything now. The witnesses, the court employees, the body camera clipped to his own uniform, the dispatch call still open on his radio. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said, but not because of who I am. Harrison studied her face. Naomi continued, call a supervisor because the identification was valid before anyone knew my title. The procedure should not change depending on whether the person in handcuffs is a judge. A woman in the crowd lowered her phone slightly. One of the attorneys near the steps looked down at the pavement. Mercer opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to apologize, but Naomi was not finished. I told you to verify the card, she said. You had the information in your hand. Mercer looked at the credential again. There was no anger in her voice. That was what made the words impossible to dismiss. A supervisor was already being requested through dispatch when Naomi turned toward the courthouse entrance. She climbed the first step, then the second, carrying the same blue file Mercer had ignored only minutes earlier. Behind her, the plaza slowly began breathing again, but the moment had changed. What had looked like a simple detention was becoming something larger, and everyone standing there could feel it. Naomi reached the doors, then stopped and glanced back once. Not at the cameras, not at the crowd. At Mercer. His face had lost its certainty. For the first time that afternoon, he was the one waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. Naomi Carter disappeared through the courthouse doors just as the clock above the security desk moved to 12:28, leaving Daniel Mercer on the plaza with a gathering of witnesses and a silence he could no longer control. Inside, the air felt cooler, quieter, almost unreal after the brightness outside. Emily Brooks walked beside Naomi toward the elevators, still holding herself as if one wrong word might break the composure she had forced into place. Are you all right? She asked softly. Naomi glanced down at the faint marks where the handcuffs had rested, then adjusted her sleeve. I am able to proceed. Emily nodded, but the concern remained in her eyes. Thomas Reed joined them near the elevator bank, carrying a second folder and speaking in the measured tone of someone who understood that the building had just witnessed something serious. A supervisor is on the way. Chief Judge Harrison asked that the security footage be preserved. Naomi looked toward him, and the body camera footage. Already requested. The elevator doors opened. Naomi stepped inside, followed by Emily and Thomas, while several attorneys remained in the lobby watching her with expressions that mixed concern, disbelief, and respect. No one mentioned what had happened. They did not need to. On the 4th floor, the courtroom was already nearly full. Attorneys were seated at their tables. Reporters had notebooks open. A handful of spectators whispered beneath the quiet hum of the ventilation system. The case scheduled that afternoon involved allegations of police misconduct, which gave the moment an irony so sharp that even Naomi felt it before she entered. She stopped outside the courtroom for 1 second and closed her eyes. Not because she was afraid, because she understood the responsibility waiting on the other side of those doors. Personal anger had no place on the bench. Neither did humiliation. Justice required distance, even when injustice had followed you to lunch. Emily watched her straighten the blue file in her hands. Do you want Chief Judge Harrison to reassign the hearing? Naomi opened her eyes. No. Are you sure? If I step away because of what happened outside, then what happened outside gets to decide what I do in here. Thomas Reed gave a small nod. The courtroom doors opened. Everyone rose. Naomi walked toward the bench with the same controlled pace she had used on the plaza, but something about the room had changed. Word was already spreading. A reporter in the second row looked at his phone, then at Naomi, then back at his phone. One attorney whispered something to another and immediately stopped when Naomi took her seat. "Please be seated," she said. Her voice was steady. The room obeyed. For the next several minutes, she focused entirely on the case before her, reviewing motions, asking precise questions, and giving both sides the same careful attention. Outside, however, Daniel Mercer was facing a very different kind of questioning. Sergeant Laura Bennett arrived in a marked vehicle and spoke with him near the courthouse steps. She was a white woman in her early 40s with nearly 2 decades of service and a reputation for following procedure without drama. "Start from the beginning," she told him. Mercer explained that he had seen Naomi using the employee entrance, believed the identification might be fraudulent, and detained her while attempting verification. Bennett listened without interrupting. Then she asked the simplest question of the afternoon. "What specifically made you believe the credential was fraudulent?" Mercer hesitated. It did not look right. Bennett held out her hand. "Show me." He gave her Naomi's credential. Bennett studied it for several seconds. "This is standard courthouse identification." Mercer shifted his stance. "I did not know that at the time." "Did you call courthouse security before detaining her?" "No." "Did you run the identification number first?" "No." "Did she refuse to identify herself?" Mercer looked toward the courthouse doors. "No." Bennett's expression remained neutral, but her next words landed heavily. "Then I need you to explain what information you were acting on." Mercer said nothing. Across the plaza, one of the witnesses lowered his phone after saving the recording. Another had already sent the video to a local newsroom. Inside the courtroom, Naomi continued listening to testimony as if nothing outside those walls existed. But something had already begun moving through the building, through the phones in people's hands, through the official channels now preserving every second of what had happened. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether Daniel Mercer had made a mistake. The question was why he had been so certain before he had any facts at all. By 1:15 that afternoon, the story had begun to travel faster than anyone inside the courthouse could contain it. A short video from the plaza had reached a local reporter, then another, and within minutes the same images were appearing across phones throughout the building. Naomi Carter knew none of that yet. She remained on the bench, listening as an attorney finished presenting evidence in the misconduct hearing before her. Her questions were measured, her attention exact, but beneath the calm surface she could feel the earlier moment returning in fragments. Daniel Mercer refusing to read the identification card, the change in his voice when she asked him to verify it, the way he had seemed more certain with every fact he ignored. She pushed the memory aside and focused on the record. In her courtroom, assumptions were not evidence. That principle had guided her for years, and today it felt heavier than ever. When the hearing entered a brief recess, Emily Brooks approached the bench with a folded note. Naomi opened it and read 3 lines. Sergeant Laura Bennett had formally reported the incident. The body camera footage had been secured. Internal Affairs had requested immediate review. Naomi looked up. "How much of this is public?" Emily hesitated. "Enough." Naomi exhaled slowly. Outside the courtroom, Chief Judge William Harrison was speaking with courthouse counsel, while Thomas Reed gathered written statements from employees who had witnessed the detention. No one appeared eager to turn the moment into spectacle. That, Naomi appreciated. Accountability was not theater. It was process. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer sat in a small interview room at the precinct less than 2 miles away, his duty belt locked in a temporary evidence cabinet, and his written statement unfinished on the table in front of him. Sergeant Bennett sat across from him with a legal pad. "Walk me through the identification again," she said. Mercer rubbed his forehead. "I thought it might be fake." "Why?" He stared at the table. Something about the situation felt wrong. Bennett's expression did not change. "That is not an objective reason." Mercer shifted in his chair. "She was using an employee entrance. So were dozens of other people today." He said nothing. Bennett continued. "Did she threaten you?" "No." "Did she attempt to leave?" "No." "Did she refuse to identify herself?" "No." Each answer made the room quieter. Then Bennett slid a printed still image across the table, captured from his own body camera. It showed Naomi holding the credential directly in front of him. The courthouse seal was clearly visible. Her photograph was clear. Her title was clear. Mercer looked away. I should have checked it first, he said. Bennett waited. That is true, she replied. But Internal Affairs is going to ask why you did not. Back at the courthouse, Naomi stepped into her chambers and finally allowed herself to sit. On her desk was a framed photograph of her parents taken 20 years earlier at her law school graduation. Her father had worked 32 years for the United States Postal Service. Her mother had taught public school in Virginia for nearly 4 decades. Neither had raised her to believe titles made a person worthy of respect. They had taught her the opposite. Respect came first. Titles came later. Naomi looked at the photograph for several seconds before Emily entered quietly. The video is being shared online, she said. Naomi nodded once. What are people saying? Most of them are angry. Naomi turned toward the window overlooking the courthouse plaza. The same stone steps were visible below. The place looked ordinary again. People crossed with coffee cups. Cars waited at the light. Nothing about the scene revealed what had happened less than an hour earlier. Anger is easy, Naomi said. What matters is whether anyone learns from it. Emily watched her carefully. Do you want to make a statement? Naomi considered the question. Then she shook her head. Not yet. She returned to the blue case file on her desk. First, we finished the work in front of us. But as she opened the folder, another message appeared on Emily's phone. Internal Affairs had found something unexpected. Daniel Mercer had been the subject of previous complaints involving questionable stops and identification disputes. None had resulted in serious discipline. Until now, Internal Affairs did not need long to understand why the previous complaints mattered. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Sergeant Laura Bennett was seated in a conference room with 2 investigators, a department attorney, and a stack of reports that had once seemed unrelated. One involved a college professor questioned outside his own building after showing employee identification. Another described a black business owner stopped near a loading entrance and repeatedly asked to prove that he belonged there. A third complaint came from a nurse leaving a hospital parking garage after midnight. Different places, different people, the same pattern. Identification presented. Identification doubted. Assumptions made first, verification attempted later. None of the earlier incidents had produced enough evidence for serious discipline because the accounts had become competing versions of the same encounter. This time there was a body camera. This time there were courthouse cameras. This time there were more than a dozen witnesses, several independent recordings, a dispatch log, and an identification card that had been valid from the moment Naomi Carter placed it in Daniel Mercer's hand. Bennett turned one page, then another. How were these closed? She asked. One investigator, Marcus Hill, leaned back slightly. Insufficient evidence. Counseling recommended in 2 of them. Bennett looked toward the date on the oldest report. 3 years ago. Correct. She let the silence sit there. Across town, Naomi was finishing the afternoon hearing. She had spent nearly 2 hours examining testimony about whether an officer had followed department procedure during a separate stop months earlier. The coincidence was impossible to ignore, yet Naomi kept her questions precise and limited to the evidence. When the final attorney sat down, she looked over the courtroom. The court will take the matter under advisement, she said. A written decision will follow. Her gavel touched the bench once, softly, and the room began to move. Reporters stood immediately. Naomi saw their attention turn toward her, but Chief Bailiff Thomas Reed stepped forward before anyone could approach. Judge Carter will not answer questions inside the courtroom. Naomi collected her files and walked toward chambers. Behind the closed door, Chief Judge William Harrison was waiting. He had removed his robe and held a folder in one hand. Internal Affairs called, he said. Naomi placed her blue file on the desk. Emily told me about the complaints. Harrison nodded. There are several. Naomi sat slowly. Were they all investigated? Technically, yes. That was not what I asked. Harrison understood the distinction. He set the folder down. Some were reviewed more seriously than others. Naomi looked through the window toward the city skyline. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the brick buildings, turning the glass towers gold. Then this cannot become a story about a judge receiving special treatment. Harrison studied her. It already is a story about a judge. That is exactly the problem. She turned back toward him. If my title is the only reason anyone finally looks carefully, then we have learned nothing. Harrison did not answer immediately. Naomi continued, her voice quiet but firm. The professor did not have a courtroom full of people waiting for him. The business owner did not have courthouse employees running through those doors. The nurse did not have reporters recognizing her name. Their identification should have mattered just as much as mine. Harrison lowered his eyes toward the folder. In the precinct conference room, Bennett had reached the same uncomfortable conclusion from a different direction. She placed Mercer's current incident report beside the older complaints and drew a line beneath one sentence repeated across two files. Subject was unable to provide satisfactory explanation for presence. Bennett stared at the wording. Satisfactory to whom? She asked. Marcus Hill looked at her, then at the reports. No one answered. By 4:15, Mercer had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. When Bennett informed him, he looked more stunned by the accumulated complaints than by the suspension itself. Those cases were closed, he said. Closed does not mean erased, Bennett replied. Mercer looked through the glass wall toward the hallway beyond it. For the first time, his mistake on the courthouse plaza was no longer a single afternoon he could explain away. It had become a mirror reflecting years of decisions, and behind every page was a person whose name he had once forgotten. The next morning, Richmond woke to a story that no longer belonged only to the people who had stood on the courthouse plaza. Local television stations replayed the footage before sunrise. By 8 o'clock, reporters were gathered near the stone steps. Microphones pointed toward the entrance where Naomi Carter had walked through less than 24 hours earlier. Yet inside her chambers, Naomi refused to watch the coverage. She was reading the preliminary internal affairs summary instead. 7 pages. 3 prior complaints. 2 supervisory counseling notes. 1 pattern that had never been examined as a pattern. Chief Judge William Harrison sat across from her while Emily Brooks organized the morning calendar nearby. Naomi stopped at a paragraph describing Daniel Mercer's earlier encounter with the college professor. He showed identification twice, she said. Harrison nodded. According to the complaint. And the officer still questioned whether he belonged in the building. Yes. Naomi turned another page. The business owner had produced keys, registration documents, and a lease agreement. Still questioned. The nurse had shown hospital identification. Still questioned. Naomi closed the folder. Then yesterday was not the beginning. Harrison leaned forward. No. It was simply the first time the person being doubted had enough institutional visibility that nobody could look away. The truth of that sentence remained between them. Across town, Daniel Mercer sat alone in an administrative office waiting for his formal interview. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment the courthouse doors opened. Not the crowd. Not the cameras. Naomi. Her calm expression when Thomas Reed called her Judge Carter. Mercer had spent the night telling himself that he had made a procedural mistake, that he had been cautious, that anyone could have misunderstood the situation. But the old complaints on the table made those explanations harder to hold. Marcus Hill entered carrying a recorder and several files. Sergeant Laura Bennett followed. This interview is part of the administrative investigation, Bennett said. You will have the opportunity to explain every decision you made. Mercer nodded. Hill opened the first file. Yesterday, you stated that Judge Carter's identification did not look right. What feature appeared incorrect? Mercer stared at the photograph from his body camera. I cannot point to one. Did the courthouse seal appear incorrect? No. Did the photograph fail to match her appearance? No. Did the access code appear altered? No. Hill waited. Mercer shifted in his chair. I had a feeling something was off. Bennett's voice remained quiet. A feeling about the credential, or a feeling about the person holding it? Mercer looked up. The question struck harder than accusation because there was no anger behind it. Only precision. He opened his mouth, then stopped. Imagine being forced to explain a decision after every excuse has been removed, when the uniform, the noise, and the certainty of the moment are gone and only the facts remain. Mercer looked down at his hands. I do not know, he said. Bennett pushed one of the older complaint files toward him. Then look at this. Mercer recognized the professor's name only vaguely. He read the report, then the next one. His expression changed as certain phrases appeared again and again. Suspicious presence. Questionable access. Unsatisfactory explanation. Each had sounded reasonable when written alone. Together, they sounded different. I did not remember these people, Mercer said. Marcus Hill answered softly. They remembered you. Back at the courthouse, Naomi stepped into the hallway between hearings and saw a black man in his late 50s waiting beside the security desk. He wore a brown sport coat and held an old folder against his chest. Emily approached Naomi quietly. His name is Dr. Samuel Price. He says Officer Mercer stopped him 3 years ago outside the university administration building. Naomi looked toward him. Samuel did not appear angry. He looked tired. That somehow mattered more. Naomi walked over. Dr. Price? He nodded. Your Honor. You came because of the investigation? Samuel looked toward the courthouse doors. I came because yesterday, for the first time, somebody believed a story I have been telling for 3 years. Naomi felt the words settle heavily in her chest. She had thought the most important moment was when those doors opened for her. Now she understood something deeper. Justice was not complete because the doors opened for one powerful person. Justice would mean making sure they opened for everyone. Dr. Samuel Price stayed near the security desk for several moments after speaking with Naomi Carter, as if he had carried those 3 years into the courthouse with him and was only now deciding whether he could finally set some of that weight down. Naomi asked Emily Brooks to arrange a private meeting room, not because Samuel had requested special treatment, but because his story deserved more than a conversation in a hallway. Within an hour, 2 more people connected to earlier complaints contacted Internal Affairs. One was Marcus Ellison, the owner of a small printing company on the east side of Richmond. The other was Angela Reed, a registered nurse who worked overnight shifts at St. Catherine Medical Center. Their accounts differed in detail, but the rhythm was painfully familiar. Each had been somewhere they had every right to be. Each had produced valid identification. Each had been treated as though proof of belonging was somehow less convincing when it came from them. By late morning, Sergeant Laura Bennett sat with Marcus Hill in the same conference room where Daniel Mercer had been interviewed. 3 files were now open across the table. This changes the scope, Hill said. Bennett shook her head slowly. No, the scope was always this wide. We just failed to see it. Across the hall, Mercer sat with his representative, staring at a written notice explaining that the investigation had expanded beyond the courthouse incident. The language was formal, almost cold, but he understood what it meant. Yesterday, he had believed he was defending a decision made in less than 5 minutes. Today, he was being asked to account for years. He looked toward Bennett when she entered. Are they trying to make me responsible for every complaint anyone ever filed? He asked. Bennett closed the door behind her. No. They are asking whether those complaints describe the same decision-making pattern. Mercer leaned back. I never targeted anyone. Bennett placed the 3 reports on the table. Then explain why the same mistake keeps happening to the same kind of people. Mercer did not answer. There was no accusation in her tone, only the unbearable weight of repetition. At the courthouse, Naomi returned to her chambers after meeting Samuel. Chief Judge William Harrison was waiting beside the window. The department wants to know whether you will participate in a formal interview this afternoon, he said. Of course. Harrison studied her. You realize the news coverage is getting larger. Naomi placed her files on the desk. That should not change the facts. It may change the pressure. Pressure is not evidence either. Harrison almost smiled, but the moment was too serious. Naomi sat and looked at the notes Emily had taken from Samuel's account. He said something I cannot stop thinking about. What? That yesterday was the first time someone believed him. Harrison looked down. Naomi continued. Imagine carrying the truth for 3 years and watching it become less valuable simply because nobody important was standing beside you when it happened. The words stayed in the room. That afternoon, Naomi gave her statement to Internal Affairs in a quiet conference chamber on the 2nd floor. She described everything in order. The employee entrance, the request for identification, the credential in Mercer's hand, her request that he verify it, the detention, the dispatch call, the courthouse doors opening. She did not exaggerate. She did not speculate about his thoughts. When Marcus Hill asked what she believed motivated Mercer, Naomi paused. I cannot testify to what was in his mind, she said. I can only tell you what he did with the information in front of him. Hill nodded. And what do you believe should happen now? Naomi looked across the table. The same thing I would ask for in my courtroom. Review the evidence. Compare the pattern. Give everyone due process. Then act on what the facts show. By sunset, Internal Affairs had completed its preliminary recommendation. Mercer would remain on administrative leave while the department opened a broader review of his conduct and the supervisory decisions that had allowed earlier complaints to disappear into separate files. But the most important line was near the bottom of the report. The department would also audit similar identification-based stops from the previous 5 years. Naomi read that sentence twice when Harrison showed it to her. For the first time since the plaza, she felt something beyond anger or disappointment. Not satisfaction. Something quieter. Movement. The handcuffs had been removed from her within minutes. The deeper problem had taken years to see. Now, finally, the system was being forced to look. 3 weeks later, the courthouse plaza looked almost exactly as it had that Tuesday afternoon, but Naomi Carter no longer saw it the same way. The stone steps were still crowded at lunchtime. Attorneys still crossed the square with coffee in one hand and files in the other. Buses still sighed at the curb. People still hurried through the glass doors without thinking about who might be questioned before reaching them. What had changed was what the city now knew. The department review had confirmed repeated failures in Daniel Mercer's judgment during identification-based encounters, along with supervisory gaps that had allowed earlier complaints to be treated as isolated events. Mercer was removed from street duty while disciplinary proceedings moved forward, but Naomi refused every invitation to describe the outcome as revenge. Revenge had never been the point. That morning, she stood before a packed public hearing alongside Dr. Samuel Price, Marcus Ellison, Angela Reed, Sergeant Laura Bennett, and several community representatives. Chief Judge William Harrison sat in the front row. Reporters filled the back of the room, but Naomi spoke as if she were addressing only one person at a time. What happened to me was visible because of where I work, she said. What happened to others was easier to ignore because the doors did not open for them. The room became completely still. Samuel lowered his eyes for a moment. Angela folded her hands in her lap. Naomi continued. A title did not make my identification more valid. A robe did not make my dignity more important. The law cannot wait to discover who someone is before deciding whether they deserve fairness. Across town, Mercer watched the hearing from a quiet administrative office. No uniform, no crowd, no authority to hide behind. Just a screen and the words of the woman he had once dismissed before learning her name. He listened as the department announced new verification procedures, mandatory review of repeated complaint patterns, and supervisory audits designed to catch the kind of assumptions that had previously disappeared into paperwork. None of those changes erased what had happened. Naomi understood that. Samuel understood it better than anyone. But accountability was never about pretending the past could be rewritten. It was about refusing to let the same failure become somebody else's future. After the hearing ended, Naomi walked outside alone. The afternoon sun was warm, and a light breeze moved between the buildings. Near the employee entrance, she stopped at the exact place where Mercer had first questioned her. For a moment, she remembered the blue file falling to the pavement, the identification card in his hand, the certainty in his voice, and the sound of those courthouse doors opening behind her. Thomas Reed stepped outside a few minutes later, but remained several feet away, giving her space. Naomi looked toward the entrance, then toward the street. You know what people keep telling me, she said. Reed waited. That I was lucky everyone came outside when they did. Were you? Naomi thought about Samuel Price waiting 3 years to be believed. She thought about Marcus Ellison proving ownership of his own business. She thought about Angela Reed finishing a hospital shift only to be treated as suspicious in the parking garage where she worked. Then Naomi shook her head. No, she said quietly. Justice should not depend on who comes through the door. Reed nodded. Naomi started walking back toward the courthouse. This time, no crowd gathered. No phones rose. No one spoke her title. She simply entered because she belonged there. And somewhere behind the glass, reflected in the same doors that had once changed everything for one woman, was the larger truth the city had finally been forced to face. Authority can command attention, but only fairness earns trust.